Hi everybody and welcome to Murder at Bedtime with me, your host Lyndon. If you are a regular listener, you know by now that I think you are all awesome. This is a no-frills, waffle-free 10 to 20 minute true crime bedtime story, and if this is your first time here, I hope I can persuade you to stay. I would like to say that this is quite an horrific murder, so please be careful if you are easily triggered. And with that, plump up your pillows, pull up the duvet, and let's crack on with tonight's episode, The Gruesome Death of Ann Pullin. At around 7 a.m. on the morning of the 31st of August 1833, 12-year-old James Pullin bounded down the stairs of the White Hart Inn in Newbury Street, Wantage, now part of Oxfordshire, where he lived, with his widowed stepmother Ann Pullin and his 6-year-old half-sister. Making his way towards the kitchen, he was very excited. He was going fishing for the day with his friend Thomas Gregory, the local milk boy. He was slightly puzzled, however, that the shutters were still closed and the usual hustle and bustle of his stepmother getting ready for another busy day at the inn could not be heard. So on entering the kitchen, the first thing he did was push open the shutters to let in the early morning sun. The horrifying sight that met him rooted him to the spot. Blood covered the walls and floor of the scullery kitchen, and at his feet lay the body of his stepmother, and at her feet lay her decapitated head, with staring eyes and her bonnet still tied under her chin. Just at that moment, Thomas the milk boy ran into the kitchen, looking for his friend. Seeing the ghastly sight, he screamed, breaking the spell on James, and he too screamed at the top of his voice. A neighbour, Mr. Poskin, hearing the noise, went to investigate, and realising he could do nothing after surveying the horrible sight, took the children away from the house and called for the police. They started their inquiries around the White Hart and its surrounding area, and very soon found a prime suspect, an 18-year-old pea and bean reaper by the name of George King, who worked at a farm just outside the town. Now apparently this is a very skilled job, and George King was not only good at it, but fast too. With the use of a wicked-looking curved knife called a bean hook, the job entailed the severing of the beanstalks without damage to the long tender crops. The examining police surgeon said that Anne's head had been cut off with just one Herculean swipe, and a bean hook was just such an instrument that could have done just that. So what pointed the finger at young George King straight away? Well, it turned out he was in fact staying in a room at the White Hart while working at the farm. He was not a local, being originally from Cumnor. So George finishes work around 7 p.m. and he's in need of a good drink, like most of us on a Friday night. So he walks into town and into the Squirrel Public House on Grove Street, where he has a few beers before making his way to the White Hart. A customer leaving the pub sees him arrive, and when George gets in the pub, there is just one customer and his dog left. George says he is hungry, so Anne cuts him a big rasher of bacon, which he frizzles on his bean hook on the open fire. The guy and his dog leave soon after, a bit miffed, the man, not the dog, because he had been in the middle of chatting up the landlady when George arrived, and now he could see his charm had been wasted and there would be no free bacon for him tonight. When he left, Anne took her keys and locked the door and bolted it. As far as she was concerned, she was now closed for the evening. Now, what happened next, only George knows, because he changed his story so many times. But what is not in doubt is that he cut off her head with one swipe of his bean hook, a weapon that is sharper than I can even imagine. He then cut the pocket out of her apron that held her purse. He put the pocket under his arm. He then got the keys and a candle and had a real struggle getting the door unlocked and unbolted. Because he had his hands full, he dropped the candle and trod on it, putting it out, before finally wrenching the door open and making his escape. Tossing the blood-stained material pocket into a pond as he went and washing his hands in the river. Anyway, from there, George must have realised that he needed an alibi, so made his way to the nearby Blue Boar Inn. He walked in with his overcoat over his arm, which was strange, thought the landlord, as it was raining outside and he didn't appear to be wet, and with his trusty bean hook in his hand. I think I would be a bit worried if a man walked into a bar carrying a very large, sharp, curved knife, but presumably it did not have blood dripping off the end of it, so nobody batted an eyelid. But of course, they did take notice when he started to act strangely. He ordered a pint of beer, then proceeded to try and give it away without tasting it, saying he no longer fancied it. He then asked if the inn had any rooms for the night, to which the landlord replied he didn't, but Ann Pullin over at the White Hart may have. At the mention of his ex-landlady, who was lying headless just across the road, George King became very white and agitated. He probably then realised he was acting too weirdly, and then decided to drink his pint and challenge anyone in the room to a game of skittles. Now, I am reliably informed there is still a skittle alley in the Blue Boar to this day. Anyway, the landlord is having none of it and says no more skittles as he is closing soon. At this time, there were 5 customers remaining at the inn to witness George King's strange behaviour, one of those being a young lad who worked as a bellows boy at the village blacksmith's, who in some reports was French. His name was Charles Marriott or Merriott, or Charles Mario or Mario. Anyway, King started a conversation with this young lad and offered him 6pence to accompany him to other inns in the vicinity to look for a bed for the night, because he was scared of the dark. Now, the lad was a bit hesitant, but eventually accepted, and after a fruitless search of the inns and boarding houses of Wantage, finally allowed King to share the stable on Back Street that he himself called home for the night. The poor young lad didn't get a bit of sleep, as King tossed and turned and mumbled in his sleep, at one point shouting out that he was going to hang himself. And the lad was very pleased to see the back of him, as early in the morning he made his way back to the farm to start work as normal. King was apprehended by the police at Court Farm, who firstly asked, "Where is your coat?" He firstly couldn't remember, but after further questioning he remembered he had left it under a bean sheaf in the next field and would fetch it for them. The police were a little bit too canny for a ruse like this, and they went to find it themselves. In the pocket they found a purse similar to that of Ann Pullin's, with some silver coins in it, but very damningly a bent 6pence dated from 1624 that Anne carried everywhere for good luck. Unfortunately, on this occasion, it wasn't very lucky for Anne, or for George, come to think of it. They also found blood on the coat, but of course this was in the days before forensics, so could have been anyone or anything's blood. Anne's cut-off pocket from her apron was found in the pond, and the keys to the inn at the side of the road leading to the farm. where they had been carelessly tossed. George King was no criminal mastermind. He was taken into custody and stood before the magistrate at the inquest. His first stab at blaming someone other than himself for the murder was to say he and a man called Edward, or Ned, Grant, a fellow labourer who hailed from Reading, went to the White Hart, where as he waited outside, Grant went into the inn to rob it, but ended up slicing off the poor landlady's head, Grant telling him what he had done as he came out of the door. Of course, George King, not believing this, stepped inside to take a look and described to the police the scene of the crime perfectly. When he returned outside, horrified by what he had seen, Grant told him, "If you ever repeat this to a living soul, the same will happen to you." And that is why he asked the French lad to accompany him looking for a bed for the night, because he was terrified he would bump into Grant. Of course, no Edward Grant could be found or heard of in the police search, and George never did really explain how, after all that, Grant did a runner and he ended up with the purse full of money. Anyway, he must have realised this alibi had no legs, so it was time to blame the French lad, Charles. But the landlord of the Blue Boar gave evidence telling the inquest that the lad had been sat alone all evening until the end of the night, when George King approached him about helping him find a bed for the night, and it soon became apparent that Charles had nothing to do with the murder either. The inquest found that Ann Pullin had been unlawfully killed by George King, and he alone. He would go to trial charged with her murder at the next assizes. On the way to Reading jail to await his trial, King at last told probably the tale which was most likely the closest to the truth to his prison escort, where he asked his landlady if he could share her bed. Ann Pullin had been shocked and threatened to knock his head off with a poker. King said in order to defend himself, he attempted to hit her with the blunt back of the Bean Reaper, but only succeeded in slicing off her head. Somehow, I don't think the jury will buy it. And of course, they didn't. And at the trial at Reading Crown Court on the 28th of February 1834, they found him guilty very quickly. The judge, Mr. Justice Patterson, sentenced King to hang in 3 days' time, on King's 19th birthday. He hardly batted an eyelid as the sentence was pronounced. Shortly before his execution, he did now admit he originally only intended to rob Anne, but on a whim, just because the opportunity arose, he cut off her head while she was seated and facing away from him, confirming what the police doctor had thought. George King was executed at Reading Jail on March the 3rd, 1834, before a large crowd, and he died hard, the drop only being short, and he strangled very slowly for quite a long while before finally passing away. A rather grisly footnote to this crime is the behaviour of the victim's mother and the rest of her family, who on the day of the murder, once the investigators had left, rather than mourn the death of their beloved daughter and family member, opened up the White Hart, where for the price of a pint you could join the queue to walk through the kitchen to view Anne's decapitated body, lying in a pool of congealed blood with her head resting at her feet. And as it was the weekend of the annual fair, she had no shortage of ghoulish customers. Even when the local authorities stopped her, the mother then put Anne in an open coffin with the head placed back on her neck, but with the horrific wound showing. Once again, you could walk past the coffin for the price of a pint. Families, That's the end of that quite horrific tale. I hope you found it of some interest, not what you could call enjoyable. Please keep your comments coming in on Instagram or Facebook. I always love to hear from you, or you can email me on exile.ybelly@gmail.com. If you enjoyed this episode, if you could please like, subscribe and ding the little bell, that really does help. As you know, murder at bedtime has always been a hobby to me. It started out as a way of getting me through the pandemic, and it worked. And because of that, it will always stay a hobby. No ads, no sponsors, no Patreon, no buy me a coffee. That is in no way having a go at podcasts that do these things. I am in fact a Patreon member to several podcasts and even buy a coffee or two. No, it's a personal thing between me and those loyal listeners who were there right at the start when I said it would be no frills, waffle free, no ads, etc. Right through to now, when on my podcast I have what I think is a lovely little band of listeners. I wish I could get more episodes out for you, but I know that you understand life just sometimes gets in the way. I'd just finally like to say that this episode is dedicated to Gerald Edgar Foch, my uncle, who taught me a lot, but mostly I remember him teaching me to ride a motorcycle by riding pillion. A very brave man. Miss you, Unc. Thank you for listening, and see you next time. Thank you.